Picture this. It is early evening. The sun has dipped below the horizon, and wherever you are right now, whether nestled in blankets or sitting in a quiet room with headphones on, I want you to imagine something. Close your eyes for just a moment and think about the device you're holding, the phone in your palm, the computer before you, the GPS that guided you home today, the internet connection that brought you here to this very moment. Now ask yourself a simple question. Who built this world? Most people, if pressed to answer, would tell you a story about garages and geniuses, about Steve Jobs tinkering in Cupertino, about young engineers with wild hair and wilder dreams who changed everything through pure brilliance and bootstrapped determination. This is the story we've been told, the mythology of Silicon Valley, the tale of lone inventors who conquered the world through innovation and grit. But tonight, we're going to peel back the curtain on something far more complex, far more surprising, and perhaps far more uncomfortable. Tonight, we're going to explore a hidden truth, a truth about who really built the digital age. And the answer might shake everything you thought you knew about American innovation. What if I told you that the glittering paradise of Silicon Valley, that mythical land of billion-dollar startups and transformative technology, was not born from the dreams of entrepreneurs at all? What if the iPhone in your pocket, the search engine you use every day, the social networks connecting billions of people, all owe their existence not to venture capitalists or visionary founders, but to something else entirely? Something that does not fit neatly into the story we have been sold. What if I told you that the United States government, with its vast resources and strategic imperatives, effectively created Silicon Valley? That taxpayer dollars, funneled through defense contracts and research grants, built the very foundation upon which today's tech titans stand? This is not conspiracy. This is not speculation. This is documented history that has been quietly tucked away beneath the shinier story of entrepreneurial genius. And tonight, over the next 2 hours, we're going to drift together through this hidden history. We're going to move slowly, carefully, exploring every corner of this remarkable transformation. How did government dollars create Silicon Valley? The answer is both simpler and more intricate than you might imagine. Let us begin at the beginning. But the beginning is not a garage in Palo Alto. The beginning is not a Stanford dorm room. The beginning is war. It is the early 1940s, and the world is engulfed in the second global conflict of the century. Young men are dying on beaches thousands of miles from home, and in the laboratories scattered across America, scientists and engineers are racing to build the weapons that will end the war. Radar, sonar, cryptography machines, the atomic bomb. This is the crucible in which modern technology is forged. But something else happens during these frantic years, something that will outlast the war itself. The United States government learns a valuable lesson. It learns that advanced technology wins wars, that scientific research is not merely an academic luxury but a strategic necessity, that the nation which controls the most sophisticated tools will control the future itself. And when the war ends, when the soldiers come home and the factories begin to retool for peacetime production, this lesson does not fade. Instead, it intensifies. Because now there is a new enemy. Now there is a new war. The Cold War. And this war will not be fought with soldiers alone. It will be fought with semiconductors and satellites, with computers and communication networks, with every tool that human ingenuity can devise. In 1951, a man named Frederick Terman was serving as the Dean of Engineering at Stanford University. Terman was not a flashy figure. He did not seek the spotlight. but he understood something profound about the relationship between academia, industry, and government. Terman had been born in 1900, the son of a Stanford psychology professor, and he had grown up in the shadow of the university. As a boy, his favourite hobby was ham radio. He would spend hours in his room, tinkering with circuits and coils, sending signals out into the ether, and waiting for distant voices to answer back. This early fascination with electronics would shape his entire life. He studied electrical engineering, first at Stanford and then at MIT, where he earned his doctorate. Then he returned to Stanford to teach. And it was there, in the classrooms and laboratories of his alma mater, that Terman began to build something extraordinary. During World War II, Terman had been called away from Stanford to run the radio research laboratory at Harvard. This was a secret facility dedicated to developing electronic countermeasures against enemy radar. It was high-stakes work, funded entirely by the government, and it gave Terman a first-hand look at how federal dollars could accelerate technological innovation. When the war ended, Terman returned to Stanford with a vision. He wanted to transform Stanford from a regional university into a major center of technological research. But he knew this would require money, lots of money, more money than tuition and private donations could ever provide. So Terman looked to the same source that had funded his wartime research. He looked to the United States government. Terman understood that the Pentagon was hungry for advanced electronics. The Cold War had created an insatiable demand for better radar, better communication systems, better guidance systems for the missiles that would carry nuclear warheads across continents. And Terman positioned Stanford to meet that demand. He encouraged his faculty to pursue military contracts. He helped his students start companies that could fulfill defense orders. And in 1951, he did something even more audacious. He convinced Stanford to lease portions of its land to high-tech companies. This was the birth of Stanford Industrial Park, later renamed Stanford Research Park. It was a radical idea at the time. Universities were supposed to be ivory towers, removed from the grubby concerns of commerce. But Terman saw no contradiction. He saw synergy. Companies like Varian Associates, Hewlett-Packard, Eastman Kodak, General Electric and Lockheed Corporation moved into the park. They set up laboratories and manufacturing facilities right next to the university. They hired Stanford graduates. They collaborated with Stanford professors, and they competed for government contracts. Now let me tell you about two young men. Their names were William Hewlett and David Packard. They were students of Frederick Terman in the 1930s. Both were electrical engineering students, brilliant and ambitious, and Terman saw potential in them. He encouraged them, he mentored them, and in 1939, when they decided to start a company together, Terman helped them secure their first loans. He introduced them to potential customers. He became, in many ways, their patron. Hewlett and Packard started their company in a garage in Palo Alto. This is the part of the story everyone knows, the garage, the humble beginnings. But what is often left out is what happened next. One of their first major contracts came from the military. During World War II, Hewlett-Packard produced signal generators and other electronic equipment for the armed forces. Without these government contracts, the company might never have survived its infancy. After the war, Hewlett-Packard continued to rely heavily on defense work. They produced oscilloscopes and frequency counters and microwave signal generators. Much of this equipment was purchased by the Pentagon. And the company grew and grew until it became one of the pillars of what would soon be called Silicon Valley. This pattern would repeat itself again and again. a Stanford professor would mentor promising students. Those students would start a company. That company would secure government contracts. The contracts would provide stable revenue and allow the company to grow. The company would hire more Stanford graduates, and the cycle would continue. It was an ecosystem, a carefully cultivated ecosystem in which government money flowed through universities and into private companies, watering the seeds of innovation. And Frederick Terman was the master gardener. He understood that proximity mattered, that if you put smart people close together, if you created spaces where engineers and scientists and entrepreneurs could easily interact, then ideas would flow, collaborations would form, new companies would spin out. This was the secret source, not just government money, but government money channeled through a network of institutions and people who were all working toward the same goal, building the technological tools that America needed to win the Cold War. But Terman was not working in isolation. There was a larger force at play, a force emanating from Washington. In 1958, in the wake of the Soviet launch of Sputnik, the United States government was gripped by fear. The Soviets had beaten America into space. If they could put a satellite into orbit, they could put a nuclear weapon anywhere on Earth. The technological superiority that Americans had taken for granted suddenly seemed fragile. And so the government responded with a massive influx of funding for science and technology. President Eisenhower established a new agency, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. Later it would be renamed DARPA, with the D standing for Defense. The mission of this agency was simple: to prevent technological surprises, to ensure that America would never again be caught flat-footed by an enemy's innovation. DARPA was given enormous freedom and enormous resources. It could fund projects that were too risky, too speculative, too far-fetched for traditional military procurement. It could take chances, and it did. Now we must turn our attention to something smaller than a satellite, but ultimately more important: the semiconductor. This is where the story gets truly interesting, because the semiconductor, the tiny chip of silicon that powers every electronic device you own, was not invented by Silicon Valley. It was not the product of a startup. It was the result of years of research, much of it funded by the government. The transistor, the predecessor to the integrated circuit, was invented in 1947 at Bell Laboratories. Bell Labs was the research arm of AT&T, the telephone monopoly, and it was funded by the profits from that monopoly. But the development of the transistor was also supported by military contracts during World War II. The scientists at Bell Labs had been working on radar and other electronic systems for the armed forces, and when they invented the transistor, they knew immediately that it had military applications. By the late 1950s, several companies were racing to develop better transistors and eventually integrated circuits. Two companies led the pack: Texas Instruments and Fairchild Semiconductor. Texas Instruments was an established firm with deep ties to the military. Fairchild was a startup founded in 1957 by 8 young engineers who had defected from Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory. These 8 men, later known as the Traitorous 8, included Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce, who would go on to found Intel. When Fairchild was born, it needed customers, and it found them in the United States military. In July 1958, Fairchild fulfilled its first order: 100 silicon transistors at $150 each. This was 30 times the going rate for transistors made of germanium. Why would anyone pay such an outrageous price? Because the customer was the military, and the military valued performance over cost. Specifically, Fairchild won a contract to supply transistors for the guidance system of the Air Force's Minuteman nuclear ballistic missile. This was a godsend for the company. Here was a customer willing to pay premium prices for cutting-edge technology. A customer that needed reliability and performance more than low cost. A customer that could provide steady orders while the civilian market was still figuring out what to do with transistors. But there was a problem. Fairchild's transistors were fragile. They failed frequently in laboratory tests. If Fairchild could not improve the reliability of its products, it would lose the military contracts, and without those contracts, the company would die. So the engineers at Fairchild worked frantically to solve the problem. One of them, Jean Huerny, developed a revolutionary new design. He created a thin protective layer of silicon oxide mounted on top of the transistor. This became known as the planar process. It made transistors more reliable, increased manufacturing yields, and lowered costs. The planar process was a breakthrough, and it was driven by the need to meet the exacting standards of a military customer. Meanwhile, at Texas Instruments, an engineer named Jack Kilby was working on a related problem. In the fall of 1958, Kilby built the first integrated circuit. Instead of having individual transistors performing separate functions, he put multiple components on a single piece of silicon. This was a radical innovation. It meant that complex circuits could be miniaturized, that computers could become smaller and more powerful, that entire systems could fit onto a chip the size of a fingernail. Texas Instruments announced Kilby's invention in March 1959. But building integrated circuits was one thing. Building them reliably and at scale was another, and once again, it was the government that stepped in to bridge the gap. The Air Force awarded Texas Instruments a contract worth over $1 million to design and fabricate circuits for military applications. And not long after, NASA announced that its prototype Apollo guidance computer would use integrated circuits from Fairchild. The Air Force announced it would use integrated circuits in the Minuteman II missile guidance package. These were enormous decisions. NASA and the Air Force were betting on a relatively new and unproven technology. There was considerable risk, but the potential payoff was worth it. Lighter guidance systems meant missiles could carry more fuel or more payload. Smaller computers meant spacecraft could carry more instruments. By the mid-1960s, NASA was buying 60% of all the integrated circuits produced in the United States. 60%. Think about that for a moment. More than half of the entire market for this revolutionary new technology was a single customer, the United States government. And NASA was not buying a few chips here and there. Fairchild alone shipped about 100,000 devices for the Apollo space program in 1964. This created economies of scale. In 1961, a single integrated circuit cost $32. By 1971, thanks to mass production driven by government demand, the cost had plummeted to $1.25. By 2000, the price of a much more powerful chip was less than a nickel. It was government that created the large demand that facilitated mass production of the microchip. Without that demand, without those early military and space contracts, the semiconductor industry would have developed much more slowly. Perhaps it would not have developed in Silicon Valley at all. The government was not just a customer. It was the customer. It was the stable, deep-pocketed buyer that allowed these fragile young companies to survive their early years. It was the entity willing to pay premium prices for performance, willing to take risks on unproven technology, willing to provide feedback and specifications that pushed engineers to innovate faster and better. The government was, in the words of one historian, the collaborative first customer. But government support for Silicon Valley went far beyond purchasing semiconductors. There was also direct funding for research, grants and contracts that paid for the basic science underlying new technologies. And much of this funding flowed through DARPA, the agency created in the wake of Sputnik. One of DARPA's most visionary program managers was a man named Joseph Carl Robnet Licklider. Licklider was a psychologist and computer scientist who had a radical idea. He believed that computers could be more than just calculating machines. He believed they could be tools for communication and collaboration. He envisioned a future where computers were networked together, where people could share information across vast distances instantaneously. In the early 1960s, this was science fiction. Computers were enormous, expensive machines that required specialized training to operate. They were housed in climate-controlled rooms and tended by priesthoods of technicians. The idea that they could be networked, that they could communicate with each other, seemed absurd to many people. But Licklider was persistent, and DARPA gave him the resources to pursue his vision. In the mid-1960s, DARPA began funding research into computer networking. This research was distributed across multiple universities: UCLA, Stanford, the University of Utah, UC Santa Barbara. These institutions received grants to develop the hardware and software needed to connect computers. And in 1968, DARPA contracted a company called BBN Technologies to build the first routers. These devices, called interface message processors, would enable the fledgling network to function. A year later, ARPANET became operational. The first computer-to-computer signal was sent between UCLA and the Stanford Research Institute on October 29, 1969. It was a simple message, just the word login. Except the system crashed after the first two letters. So the first message sent over the internet was actually low, as in lo and behold, as in look at this, as in the world is about to change. ARPANET started with 4 nodes, 4 universities, but it grew quickly. By 1971 there were 15 nodes. By the end of the decade there were dozens, and DARPA continued to fund the development of the protocols and technologies that would allow this network to expand: the Transmission Control Protocol, the Internet Protocol, TCP/IP, the foundation of the modern Internet. All of this was paid for with government money. All of this was the result of a Defense Department initiative to create secure communications networks. The Internet, the technology that has transformed every aspect of modern life, was born in government laboratories and university research centers funded by taxpayer dollars. It was not a commercial venture. It was not the product of market forces. It was the result of strategic government investment in long-term, high-risk research. And DARPA did not stop with networking. The agency funded research in artificial intelligence, in computer graphics, in time-sharing systems that allowed multiple users to access a single computer simultaneously. In the 1970s, DARPA identified a bottleneck in chip development. Designing new integrated circuits required fabricating prototypes, but most universities and small companies did not have access to fabrication facilities. So DARPA created a university-affiliated lab that would fabricate any microchip with the superior design. This dramatically lowered the barriers to innovation. Suddenly, anyone with a good idea could get a prototype made. DARPA also launched the Very Large-Scale Integrated Circuits program, coordinating research across multiple institutions to develop new chip designs. This kind of strategic coordination, this willingness to invest in infrastructure and basic research, was something only the government could do. Private companies focused on products they could sell in the next quarter or the next year. Universities focused on academic research that would lead to publications and tenure. But the government, with its long-time horizons and its strategic imperatives, could invest in the kind of foundational research that would pay dividends decades later. There is another piece of the puzzle we must examine: venture capital. Today, venture capital is synonymous with Silicon Valley. Firms like Sequoia Capital and Andreessen Horowitz are household names in the tech world. They provide the funding that allows startups to grow from tiny teams into billion-dollar companies. But where did venture capital come from? How did it become such a central part of the Silicon Valley ecosystem? The answer, once again, involves the government. In 1958, Congress passed the Small Business Investment Company Act. This legislation was designed to encourage investment in small businesses. It created a new type of entity called a Small Business Investment Company, or SBIC. These were private firms that could receive government loans to invest in startups. For every dollar of private capital and SBIC raised, it could borrow up to $2 from the Small Business Administration at favorable interest rates. This was government leverage. Public money amplifying private investment. The SBIC program had its problems. There were regulatory constraints. There were cases of fraud. Some SBICs saw government funds as a license to steal. But the program also had a profound impact. By 1968, over 600 SBIC funds provided 75% of all venture funding in the United States. 75%. The government was not just supporting technological research. It was supporting the financial infrastructure that allowed that research to be commercialized. It was creating a culture of risk capital, encouraging investors to put money into unproven companies with uncertain futures. And while the SBIC program would eventually decline in importance as other forms of venture capital emerged, it played a crucial role in the early decades. It demonstrated that investing in startups could be profitable. It trained a generation of investors. It provided the initial capital that allowed many Silicon Valley companies to get off the ground. Now let us pause for a moment and take stock of what we've learned so far. We have seen that the United States government played a central role in the creation of Silicon Valley. Through Stanford University and the vision of Frederick Terman, the government funneled contracts and grants to emerging technology companies. Through the Pentagon and NASA, the government became the primary customer for semiconductors in their early years, providing the demand that allowed mass production and cost reduction. Through DARPA, the government funded the basic research that led to the Internet, to advances in artificial intelligence, to new chip designs and fabrication techniques. Through the SBIC program, the government helped create the venture capital industry that would finance countless startups. This was not a laissez-faire process. This was not the invisible hand of the market working its magic. This was deliberate, strategic, government-led industrial policy. And it worked. But there is an irony here that we must acknowledge. The story we tell ourselves about Silicon Valley is a story of entrepreneurial freedom, of garage startups and visionary founders who defied the establishment and changed the world. We celebrate figures like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates as self-made men who succeeded through talent and determination. And there is truth to this story. These individuals were brilliant. They worked incredibly hard. They made bold decisions and took enormous risks. But they did not do it alone. They stood on foundations built by government investment. The microprocessors in the first Apple computers were descendants of chips developed for military applications. The graphical user interface that made the Macintosh revolutionary was based on research funded by DARPA at Xerox PARC. The Internet that allowed Microsoft to dominate the software industry was a government creation. Even the touchscreen technology in the iPhone can be traced back to government-funded research. Every major technology that makes your smartphone smart was funded by the government. The internet, GPS, touchscreen displays, the microprocessor, lithium-ion batteries, voice recognition. All of these technologies were developed, at least in part, with public money. Apple did not invent these technologies. Apple integrated them brilliantly. Apple designed beautiful products and created an ecosystem that delighted consumers. But the fundamental technologies were gifts from the American taxpayer. And this raises uncomfortable questions. If the public funded the research that made these companies possible, should the public share in the profits? Should there be a clawback mechanism, a way for taxpayers to recoup some of their investment when companies become enormously successful? This is a debate that continues to this day. But for now, let us continue our journey through the hidden history of Silicon Valley. Let us talk about GPS, the Global Positioning System. Today, GPS is ubiquitous. It guides your car through traffic. It helps you find restaurants. It allows farmers to plant crops with precision. It enables delivery companies to track packages. It is so deeply woven into modern life that we barely notice it. But GPS was not invented by a tech company. It was not developed for civilian use. GPS was a military project. It was called Navstar GPS, and it was developed by the United States Department of Defense between the 1970s and 1990s. The goal was to help with logistics, target identification, mapping, and tracking movements of military assets. Prototype satellites were launched in the late 1970s. By the mid-1990s, a full constellation of over 20 GPS satellites was in place. The first commercial applications of GPS appeared in the late 1980s. But the system itself, these satellites orbiting overhead, the ground stations, the control infrastructure, all of this was built and maintained by the government. It cost billions of dollars, and it was made freely available to the public. Think about that. The government spent billions of dollars developing a technology and then gave it away for free. Companies like Garmin and TomTom built businesses on top of GPS without paying licensing fees. Google Maps uses GPS without compensating the taxpayers who funded it. Your smartphone relies on GPS every day. And all of this is possible because the government decided that the benefits of widespread GPS adoption outweighed any potential revenue from licensing. This is not how private companies behave. Private companies seek to maximize profits. They patent their inventions and license them for fees. But the government, acting in the public interest, can make different choices. It can invest in technologies that have broad social benefits, even if they do not generate direct financial returns. And this is exactly what happened with GPS. The pattern is clear now. The government identifies a strategic need. It funds research and development. It builds infrastructure. And then it makes the results available to the private sector. Companies build products and services on top of this government-created foundation. They generate profits. They create jobs. They pay taxes. But the initial investment, the risky early-stage work, the infrastructure that makes everything possible, that comes from the public. This is not a criticism. This is simply a description of how innovation actually works in America. It is a far cry from the mythological story of lone inventors toiling in garages. The reality is messier, more collaborative, more dependent on institutions and collective action. But it is also more interesting. Now we must discuss the broader context in which all of this unfolded. The Cold War was not just a geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was also an ideological battle. The Soviets claimed that their system, centralized planning and state control was superior to capitalism. The Americans claimed that their system, free markets and individual liberty, was the path to prosperity and progress. But the reality on the ground was more complicated. The American government was not sitting back and letting the market work its magic. It was actively shaping the economy, directing resources towards strategic industries, picking winners and losers through contracts and subsidies. This looked suspiciously like industrial policy, the kind of thing that communist countries did, and so the government had to be careful about how it framed its actions. This is why so much government funding was channeled through defense and space programs. Investing in technology for national security was acceptable. It was patriotic. It was what governments were supposed to do. But investing in technology for purely economic reasons, for the purpose of creating jobs or building industries that smacked of communism, that suggested that the government did not trust the market. And so the rhetoric emphasized security and scientific prestige. We need better missiles to deter the Soviets. We need to put a man on the moon to prove that democracy is superior to totalitarianism. These were the justifications. The fact that these investments also created thriving industries, generated enormous wealth, and positioned America as the global leader in technology, well, that was just a happy side effect. Or so the story went. But the people involved understood what was really happening. Frederick Terman knew he was building an industrial ecosystem. The engineers at DARPA knew they were laying the groundwork for future economic growth. The venture capitalists who benefited from the SBIC program knew that government support was crucial to their success. There was a tacit understanding that industrial policy was being pursued under the cover of national security, and it worked. By the end of the Cold War, the United States had unquestioned technological superiority. Silicon Valley was the envy of the world. American companies dominated the emerging markets for personal computers, software and networking equipment. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, it seemed to vindicate the American model. But which American model? The mythological model of pure free market capitalism, or the actual model of government-led industrial policy disguised as defense spending? This is a question worth pondering. Let us now turn to the 1970s and 1980s, when Silicon Valley began to mature into the economic powerhouse we recognize today. By this time, the foundational technologies were in place. Semiconductors were cheap and reliable. Computers were becoming smaller and more affordable. The internet was still a research project, but the groundwork had been laid, and a new generation of entrepreneurs was ready to capitalize on these developments. One of the key innovations of this era was the microprocessor. In 1971, Intel released the 4004, the first commercially available microprocessor. This was a general-purpose computer on a single chip. It could be programmed to perform different tasks. It was the brain that would power the personal computer revolution. Intel had developed the 4004 under contract from a Japanese calculator company. But the potential applications extended far beyond calculators. The microprocessor could be used in anything that required computation, and once again, the government was an early adopter. Military systems, aerospace applications, industrial control systems. These were the first markets for microprocessors. As the 1970s progressed, a group of hobbyists and enthusiasts began to see the potential for personal computers. These were not corporate executives or government officials. These were tinkerers, many of them young, many of them influenced by the counterculture of the 1960s. They believed that computers should be democratized, that individuals should have access to the same computational power, that had previously been the exclusive domain of large institutions. This was a radical idea, and it led to the founding of companies like Apple Computer. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak started Apple in 1976. They built computers in a garage, selling them to members of the Homebrew Computer Club and other hobbyists. This is the part of the Silicon Valley mythology that is true. Jobs and Wozniak were entrepreneurs. They took risks, they worked hard, they had vision. But they also benefited enormously from the infrastructure that had been built over the previous 3 decades. The microprocessors they used were descendants of chips developed with government funding. The knowledge base they drew upon had been created by government-funded research. The venture capital that allowed Apple to scale up came from an industry that had been jump-started by government programs. Even the personal computer itself was based on concepts that had been developed at government-funded research institutions like Xerox PARC, which had received significant funding from DARPA. So yes, Jobs and Wozniak were brilliant. Yes, they created something new and valuable, but they did so in an environment that had been carefully cultivated by decades of government investment. The 1980s brought a new phase in Silicon Valley's evolution. The personal computer was no longer a novelty for hobbyists. It was becoming a mainstream product. IBM entered the market in 1981 with its PC, legitimizing the entire category. Software companies like Microsoft emerged to provide the operating systems and applications that made these machines useful. And the venture capital industry, which had been growing steadily since the SBIC days, began to mature into its modern form. But even during this period of seemingly pure free market capitalism, government support continued to play a crucial role. The defense budget remained enormous throughout the Reagan years. The Strategic Defense Initiative, derided by critics as Star Wars, funneled billions of dollars into research on advanced sensors, lasers, and computing systems. Many of these technologies would find civilian applications. The Internet, still primarily a research network connecting universities and government laboratories, continued to receive federal funding. In 1982, Congress passed the Small Business Innovation Development Act, creating the Small Business Innovation Research Program. SBIR was designed to stimulate technological innovation by encouraging small businesses to engage in federal research and development. Each year, federal agencies with large R&D budgets were required to set aside a small percentage for competitive awards to small businesses. The program was structured in phases. Phase 1 provided small grants to explore the feasibility of an idea. Phase 2 provided larger grants to develop prototypes. Phase 3 was supposed to lead to commercialization, either through further federal contracts or private investment. In 1983, the first year of the program, SBIR distributed $45 million. By 2008, it had grown to nearly $2 billion annually. Thousands of small companies received SBIR funding over the years. Many failed, but some succeeded spectacularly. Qualcomm, the wireless technology giant, received early SBIR funding. Symantec, the cybersecurity company, was an SBIR recipient. The program did not get as much attention as venture capital, but it was an important piece of the ecosystem. The SBIR program exemplified a key principle. The government could support innovation without picking specific winners. By running competitive grant programs, by funding multiple approaches to the same problem, by allowing companies to fail without catastrophic consequences, the government created an environment where innovation could flourish. This was not central planning in the Soviet sense. This was not the government deciding which companies should exist and which should not. But it was also not a pure free market. It was a hybrid, a system in which public investment and private enterprise worked together, and this hybrid system whatever you wanted to call it, was extraordinarily effective at generating technological progress. Let us now consider another dimension of government support that is often overlooked: immigration policy. Silicon Valley has always been a magnet for talent from around the world. A hugely disproportionate number of the Valley's engineers, entrepreneurs and scientists are immigrants, or the children of immigrants. This is not an accident. This is the result of policy choices. In 1965, Congress passed the Immigration and Naturalization Act, which ended racist quotas from the 1920s that had severely restricted immigration from Asia, Africa, and Southern and Eastern Europe. The new law prioritized skills and family reunification. It opened up America to a wave of highly educated immigrants, many of them in scientific and technical fields. These immigrants came to American universities to pursue advanced degrees. They stayed to work at American companies, and many of them started their own companies. The numbers are striking. By the early 2000s, over half of the startups in Silicon Valley had at least one immigrant founder. Companies like Google, founded by Sergey Brin, who immigrated from Russia. Yahoo, co-founded by Jerry Yang, who came from Taiwan. eBay, led for many years by Meg Whitman but with a founding team that included immigrants. Nvidia, co-founded by Jensen Huang from Taiwan. The list goes on and on. These people came to America not just because of economic opportunity, though that was certainly part of it. They came because of the quality of American universities, because of the ecosystem that had been built in places like Silicon Valley, because the United States made it relatively easy for skilled workers to immigrate and to start businesses. Immigration policy is not usually thought of as industrial policy, but in the context of Silicon Valley it functioned as such. It was a way of importing human capital, of attracting the best and brightest from around the world, and it was a policy choice that required active government intervention. Consider also the role of intellectual property law. The United States has strong patent protections. This gives inventors confidence that they will be able to profit from their inventions. But American law also has important limits on non-compete agreements. In California specifically, non-compete clauses are generally not enforceable. This means that an engineer who works at one company can leave and start a competing company, or go to work for a competitor, taking her knowledge and expertise with her. This is very different from the situation in some other states, like Massachusetts, where non-compete agreements are enforceable. The result is that Silicon Valley has much higher labor mobility than other tech hubs. Knowledge spreads more rapidly. Good ideas are not trapped inside single companies. There is constant churning, with people moving from job to job, from company to company, cross-pollinating ideas. This is not natural. This is the result of specific legal rules. California's policy on non-compete agreements dates back to the 19th century and was reaffirmed several times in the 20th century. It was a choice. And it was a choice that had profound consequences for the development of Silicon Valley. Now we must address a counterfactual question. Could Silicon Valley have emerged without government support? Some libertarian scholars argue yes. They point to the entrepreneurial energy of the people involved. They note that many Silicon Valley companies succeeded in spite of government, not because of it. They argue that the government's main contribution was to stay out of the way, to allow markets to function without excessive regulation. This is a debatable position. It is true that entrepreneurs created value. It is true that venture capitalists made smart investment decisions. It is true that engineers solved technical problems. But would they have been able to do any of this without the foundation that government investment provided? Without the semiconductors developed for military applications? without the internet created by DARPA, without the venture capital industry jump-started by the SBIC program, without the steady demand from defense contracts that allowed companies to survive their early years. Consider a thought experiment. Imagine that the United States government, after World War II, had decided to drastically cut spending on science and technology. Imagine that DARPA had never been created, that NASA had never gone to the moon, that defense contracts for semiconductors had been negligible. What would have happened? Some technological progress would have occurred anyway. Private companies would have continued to innovate. Universities would have continued to conduct research. But the pace would have been much slower. The risk-taking would have been much more limited. And it is likely that the epicenter of innovation would have been somewhere else. Perhaps in Europe, if European governments had been more aggressive in their support for technology. Perhaps in Japan, which did have significant government support for its technology industries. The point is that government investment mattered. It was not the only thing that mattered, but it was a necessary condition for the rapid technological progress that occurred in the second half of the 20th century. There is a broader lesson here about how innovation works. Innovation is not just about individual genius. It is not just about market forces. It is about ecosystems, about networks of people and institutions working together, about infrastructure, both physical and institutional, about long-term investment in basic research whose payoffs may not be apparent for decades, and about risk-taking on a scale that only governments can really undertake. Private companies can innovate within existing paradigms. They can make products better, cheaper, faster. But creating entirely new paradigms, inventing entirely new technologies, building entirely new industries, this often requires resources and time horizons that are beyond the capacity of any single firm. This is where government can play a catalytic role, by taking on the risks that private actors cannot or will not take. By investing in the foundational research that makes future innovation possible, by creating the conditions for ecosystems to emerge. Let us turn now to the 1990s, the decade when the internet exploded into public consciousness. Until the early 90s, the internet was still primarily a research network. It connected universities, government laboratories, and a few large corporations. Email was in use, but it was a tool for academics and technologists. The World Wide Web did not yet exist, but this was about to change. In 1989, a British scientist named Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN in Switzerland, proposed a new system for organizing and accessing information. He called it the World Wide Web. It used hypertext, allowing documents to link to each other. It used a simple protocol, HTTP, that allowed computers to request and receive web pages, and it used URLs, Uniform Resource Locators, to identify specific documents on the network. Berners-Lee built the first web browser and web server, and crucially, he convinced CERN to make the technology freely available. No patents, no licensing fees. The World Wide Web was a gift to humanity. This decision to make the web open and free was momentous. It meant that anyone could create a website, anyone could build a web browser, anyone could develop applications for the web, and people did. In 1993, a team at the University of Illinois led by Mark Andreessen created Mosaic, the first widely used graphical web browser. Suddenly, the web was accessible to ordinary people, not just computer scientists. You did not need to memorize arcane commands. You could point and click. You could see images and formatted text. The web became user-friendly, and it began to grow exponentially. By the mid-1990s, millions of people were online. companies began to see the commercial potential, and a wave of investment flooded into internet startups. This was the dot-com boom. Venture capitalists poured money into any company with a plausible-sounding internet business model. Amazon started selling books online. eBay created an auction platform. Yahoo organized the rapidly expanding web. Google developed a better search engine. Netscape commercialized web browser technology. Thousands of other companies, many with absurd business plans and no path to profitability, received funding. Stock prices soared. Fortunes were made overnight, and Silicon Valley became synonymous with the internet revolution. But once again, beneath the frothy surface of speculation and hype, there was a foundation built by the government. The internet itself was a government creation. The web protocols were developed at CERN, a publicly funded international research organization. The early routers and servers were built with government grants. The fiber optic cables that carried internet traffic were often laid along rights of way controlled by the government. Even the algorithms underlying Google's search engine had roots in government-funded research. Larry Page and Sergey Brin were Stanford graduate students when they developed the PageRank algorithm that made Google possible. They were supported by a National Science Foundation grant as well as funding from DARPA and NASA. The specific grant from the NSF was called the Digital Libraries Initiative, and it aimed to develop new ways of organizing and searching large collections of information. Page and Brin's work on web search was directly funded by this initiative. When they decided to turn their research into a company, they dropped out of Stanford and sought venture capital. And yes, private investors took risks on them. Yes, they built a remarkable company. But the foundational research was taxpayer funded. This is a recurring pattern. Government funds basic research at universities. Graduate students and professors make discoveries. Those discoveries are then commercialized by private companies. The companies profit. The investors profit. The founders become billionaires. And the taxpayers who funded the original research receive, well, what exactly? They receive the benefits of the technologies. They get better search engines and faster internet and more efficient logistics. These are real benefits. But there is no direct financial return. The government does not take an equity stake in the companies its research spawns. It does not collect royalties. It simply invests and hopes that the broader economic benefits will justify the expense. Some scholars, most notably economist Mariana Mazzucato, have argued that this is unfair, that the public should share in the upside when publicly funded research leads to private profits. Mazzucato points out that the government often takes on the riskiest, most speculative research, the kind that might not pay off for decades. Private investors, by contrast, typically get involved much later, when the technology is already proven and the path to commercialization is clear. Yet the private investors capture most of the financial gains. This seems like a mismatch. The risk-taker and the reward-taker are different entities. Mazzucato proposes mechanisms for the government to recoup some of its investment. Perhaps equity stakes in companies that emerge from federally funded research. Perhaps royalties on technologies developed with public money. Perhaps special taxes on industries that disproportionately benefit from government R&D. These are politically contentious ideas, but they raise important questions about fairness and about how we fund innovation going forward. The dot-com boom ended spectacularly in 2000 and 2001. The stock market crashed. Hundreds of internet companies went bankrupt. Billions of dollars of investment evaporated. For a brief moment, it seemed like the entire internet revolution had been a mirage. But of course, it was not. The real companies, the ones with actual products and actual customers, survived. Amazon kept selling books, and then expanded into everything else. Google kept refining its search engine and started selling advertising. eBay kept matching buyers and sellers. The infrastructure that had been built during the boom years, the fiber optic cables and data centers and software platforms, did not disappear. It became the foundation for the next wave of innovation. Social media, cloud computing, mobile apps. The 2000s would bring another explosion of new technologies, and once again, much of it would be built on foundations laid by government investment. Let us talk about smartphones. The iPhone, released in 2007, is often held up as the ultimate example of private sector innovation. Apple designed a beautiful product that combined a phone, a music player, and an internet device into a single elegant package. Steve Jobs presented it as a revolutionary achievement, and in many ways it was. But every core technology in the iPhone was developed with government funding. The internet, as we have discussed, was a DARPA creation. GPS was a military project. The touchscreen technology came from research funded by the CIA and the NSF. The voice recognition system, Siri, was developed by a DARPA-funded project at SRI International. The lithium-ion batteries that power the phone came out of Department of Energy research. The algorithms for signal processing came from military research. Even the HTTP protocol and HTML language that allow the iPhone to access the web were publicly funded. Apple did not invent these technologies. Apple integrated them, and Apple did it brilliantly. The company's designers and engineers created an interface that was intuitive and delightful. They built an ecosystem of apps that extended the phone's functionality in countless directions. They marketed the product with genius. But the fundamental technologies were gifts from the public sector. This is not to diminish Apple's achievement. Integration is hard. Design is hard. Building a supply chain that can manufacture millions of complex devices is hard. Creating a user experience that millions of people love is hard. Apple did all of these things extraordinarily well. But it is important to recognize that Apple did not do it in isolation. The company stood on the shoulders of decades of government-funded research, and this is true for virtually every major tech company. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, all of them have benefited enormously from technologies developed with public money. All of them have leveraged infrastructure built by the government, and all of them operate within legal and institutional frameworks created by government policy. The mythology of the self-made tech entrepreneur obscures these realities. It creates the impression that success is purely a matter of individual brilliance and hard work. And while brilliance and hard work are certainly necessary, they are not sufficient. Context matters. Infrastructure matters. Institutions matter. And government investment creates much of that context and infrastructure. Consider the role of universities. Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, University of California, Berkeley. These institutions have been central to Silicon Valley's success. They train the engineers and computer scientists who fill the Valley's companies. They conduct the research that leads to new products and new industries. They provide spaces where students and faculty can collaborate with industry, and universities are heavily subsidized by the government. Public universities receive direct appropriations from state governments. Private universities receive federal research grants. Students at both public and private universities receive financial aid from the government. Even the tax exemptions that universities enjoy represent a form of subsidy. Without this support, universities would be very different institutions. They would probably be smaller, more expensive, and less focused on research. And the pipeline of talent and ideas flowing into Silicon Valley would be much reduced. Now let us consider a different aspect of government involvement: regulation, or rather the lack of it. One of the reasons Silicon Valley thrived is that the internet in its early years was largely unregulated. The government did not try to control what could be published online. It did not tax e-commerce heavily. It did not require licenses or permits for starting an internet company. This light regulatory touch allowed experimentation and rapid growth. Companies could try new business models without having to navigate complex approval processes. If an idea did not work, they could pivot to something else. This flexibility was important, but it was also a choice. The government could have regulated the internet much more heavily. It could have treated internet service providers like telephone companies subject to common carrier obligations. It could have imposed content restrictions, as many countries do. It could have taxed online commerce from the beginning. But it chose not to, and this choice created space for innovation. It allowed the internet to develop organically. It gave entrepreneurs room to experiment. This was not laissez-faire by accident. This was a deliberate policy choice. Congress passed the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which explicitly stated that it was the policy of the United States to promote the continued development of the Internet. The Act prevented states from imposing taxes on Internet access. It protected Internet service providers from liability for content posted by users. These were important protections. They made it easier to start Internet companies. They reduced legal risks, they kept costs down, and they reflected a belief that the internet was important enough to deserve special treatment. Compare this to other countries where the internet was more heavily regulated from the start. In many European countries, privacy laws were stricter. Data protection requirements were more onerous. Telecommunications regulations applied more broadly. These countries developed thriving internet sectors, but they did not produce Silicon Valleys. The differences in regulatory approach mattered. They shaped which companies emerged and where. Now, this does not mean that no regulation is always better. There are legitimate concerns about privacy, about monopoly power, about the spread of misinformation. But in the 1990s, the light regulatory touch in the United States gave Silicon Valley a significant advantage. It was another form of government support, achieved not through spending, but through restraint. Let us now move into the 2000s and 2010s, when social media and mobile computing came to dominate the tech landscape. Facebook launched in 2004, initially as a social network for college students. It grew rapidly, expanding to high schools, then to the general public. By 2012, it had 1 billion users. Twitter launched in 2006, creating a new form of public conversation. Instagram launched in 2010, focusing on photo sharing. These platforms became central to how people communicate, how they get news, how they organize politically, and they were all built on infrastructure that the government had created. The internet, mobile networks, which relied on spectrum allocated by the government, GPS, which provided location services, algorithms that drew on decades of computer science research, much of it publicly funded. The smartphone revolution that enabled mobile social media was powered by technologies we have already discussed. But there was another government contribution worth noting. The National Science Foundation had funded research into wireless networking throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Work on protocols that would eventually become Wi-Fi and cellular data networks. When the iPhone launched with the App Store in 2008, it created a platform for thousands of developers to build mobile applications. Many of those applications relied on technologies that had been developed with public money. The GPS in your mapping app, the speech recognition in your voice assistant, the encryption that protects your data. the compression algorithms that allow you to stream video. All of these had roots in government-funded research. Cloud computing emerged as another transformative technology in the 2000s. Amazon Web Services, launched in 2006, allowed companies to rent computing power and storage instead of building their own data centers. This dramatically lowered the barriers to starting a tech company. A startup no longer needed to buy servers and hire system administrators. It could simply pay Amazon for the resources it needed, scaling up or down as required. Google, Microsoft, and others followed with their own cloud offerings. This was a genuine private sector innovation. Amazon had figured out how to turn its internal infrastructure into a product. But even here, the technology stack relied on decades of prior work. The Internet protocols that allowed distributed computing, the virtualization technologies that allowed multiple applications to run on the same physical hardware, the algorithms for load balancing and fault tolerance. Much of this foundational work had been done at universities and research labs with government support. Artificial intelligence experienced a resurgence in the 2010s, driven by new techniques called deep learning. Neural networks, which had been studied since the 1950s, suddenly became much more powerful thanks to three developments. First, vastly more data was available due to the Internet. Second, computing power had increased exponentially, making it feasible to train large models. Third, researchers developed new training algorithms that worked better. Companies like Google, Facebook, and later OpenAI invested heavily in AI research. They hired top academics. They built specialized hardware. They created AI systems that could recognize images, translate languages, play complex games, and generate text. These were impressive achievements. But once again, they built on a foundation of publicly funded research. Neural networks were invented by researchers at universities and government labs. The backpropagation algorithm that made training neural networks practical was developed in the 1970s and 1980s by academics. Much of the mathematical theory underlying machine learning came from statistics departments at universities. The computational hardware relied on the same semiconductor technologies that Edison developed with military funding decades earlier. DARPA itself continued to fund AI research throughout this period. The agency ran programs on autonomous vehicles, on robotic systems, on natural language processing. DARPA challenges, like the Grand Challenge for self-driving cars in the 2000s, spurred innovation by setting ambitious goals and offering prizes. Many of the teams that competed in these challenges went on to found companies or join existing tech firms, bringing their expertise with them. This was classic DARPA strategy. Identify an area of strategic importance, fund high-risk research, create competitions that accelerate progress, and let the private sector commercialize the results. It was the same approach that had created the Internet, the same approach that had developed GPS, and it continued to work. By the 2010s, Silicon Valley had become a global powerhouse. The 5 most valuable companies in the world were all tech companies: Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. Together they were worth trillions of dollars. They employed hundreds of thousands of people. They shaped how billions of people lived their lives, and they were all American. This was an extraordinary concentration of economic power. It was also the culmination of 7 decades of strategic government investment. Every one of these companies relied on technologies that had been developed with public money. Every one of them benefited from infrastructure that the government had built. Every one of them operated in an ecosystem that had been carefully cultivated through policy choices. Yet the mythology persisted. The story of the garage startup, the genius founder, the triumph of free markets over government planning. This story was powerful because it contained truth. There were garages, there were genius founders, there were market forces at work, but it was a partial truth. It left out the context. It ignored the foundation. It made invisible the decades of government investment that made Silicon Valley possible. And this invisibility had consequences. It shaped policy debates. It influenced how people thought about the role of government. It created a narrative in which successful entrepreneurs were entirely self-made and therefore owed nothing to society. This narrative made it easier to justify low tax rates for the wealthy, easier to resist government investment in research and infrastructure, easier to cut funding for universities and basic science. After all, if innovation comes from lone geniuses working in garages, why does the government need to fund anything? But this narrative was false, or at least profoundly incomplete. Innovation is a collective endeavor. It requires individual brilliance, yes, but it also requires institutions, universities that train people and conduct research, government agencies that fund risky projects, legal systems that protect intellectual property and enforce contracts, financial systems that allocate capital, physical infrastructure like roads and power grids and internet backbones, social infrastructure like immigration policies and education systems. All of these things are necessary for innovation to flourish, and many of them are created or shaped by government. The question is not whether government should play a role in innovation. The question is what kind of role it should play. Some argue that the government's role should be limited to funding basic research, that the government should not try to pick winners or direct the economy towards specific sectors, that once basic research is done, the market should decide which technologies succeed and which fail. This is a reasonable position. It recognizes that government has a role in funding the kind of long-term, high-risk research that private companies will not undertake, but it also respects the power of markets to allocate resources efficiently. However, the history of Silicon Valley suggests that this distinction between basic research and applied development is not as clear as it might seem. Much of what DARPA funded was not basic research in the abstract sense. It was mission-driven research aimed at specific applications, developing networking technologies for military communications, creating guidance systems for missiles, building computers for command and control. This was applied research, but it had broader implications. The technologies developed for these specific purposes turned out to have much wider applications. The Internet was developed for resilient military communications, but became a platform for commerce and social interaction. GPS was developed for precision weapons, but became a tool for navigation and logistics. This pattern suggests that government can play a productive role even in applied research, as long as the research is aimed at genuine needs and is open enough to allow for unexpected applications. Others argue that government should go further, that it should actively shape which industries develop and where, that it should use tax policy, subsidies, regulations and procurement to support strategic sectors, that it should take equity stakes in companies that emerge from publicly funded research. This is a more interventionist approach. It treats innovation as too important to leave to markets alone. It sees government as a partner in the innovation process, not just a funder of basic research. Proponents of this view point to successful examples of government-led industrial policy in other countries. South Korea's development of its semiconductor industry, Taiwan's creation of TSMC, the world's leading chip manufacturer, China's investments in renewable energy and electric vehicles, These were deliberate government efforts to build industries, and they worked. The counter-argument is that these examples are selective, that for every successful industrial policy, there are failures that wasted resources and distorted markets, that government officials are not good at predicting which technologies will succeed, that political considerations often override economic logic in government decision-making. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Government is neither omniscient nor irrelevant. It can play a productive role in fostering innovation, but it can also make mistakes. The key is to design institutions and policies that maximize the benefits of government involvement while minimizing the costs. This means creating agencies like DARPA that have clear missions, competent staff, and enough autonomy to take risks. It means funding a diverse portfolio of research projects rather than betting everything on a single approach. It means being willing to let projects fail without turning failure into a scandal. It means creating mechanisms for public input and accountability without paralyzing decision-making with red tape. It means thinking long-term, investing in infrastructure and education that will pay off decades in the future. And it means being honest about the role that government has played in past successes, rather than pretending that innovation happens purely through market forces. Silicon Valley today faces challenges that raise new questions about the role of government. The dominance of a few large platforms has raised concerns about monopoly power. Should government break up companies like Google and Facebook or regulate them more heavily? The spread of misinformation on social media has raised concerns about the health of democracy. Should government impose content moderation requirements? The use of personal data by tech companies has raised privacy concerns. Should government impose stricter data protection rules? The displacement of workers by automation and artificial intelligence has raised concerns about inequality. Should government provide stronger safety nets or retraining programs? These are difficult questions without easy answers, but they all involve choices about how much government should intervene in the tech sector. There is irony in the fact that Silicon Valley, which owes so much to government support, often resists government regulation. Many tech executives are libertarian in their politics. They believe that innovation is best left to markets, that government should get out of the way, that regulation stifles progress. This belief is not entirely unreasonable. Poorly designed regulations can indeed hinder innovation. But it ignores the history. It forgets that Silicon Valley exists because of government investment, that the technologies these companies rely on were created with public money, that the infrastructure they use was built by government. This collective amnesia has policy consequences. It makes it harder to have productive conversations about how to address the challenges that technology creates. Let us consider specific examples of how government continues to shape the tech industry today. The National Institutes of Health fund biomedical research that has led to breakthroughs in genomics, drug development, and medical devices. Many biotech companies in Silicon Valley are commercializing discoveries made in NIH-funded laboratories. The Department of Energy funds research on batteries, solar panels, and other clean energy technologies. Tesla, the electric vehicle company, benefited from a Department of Energy loan in its early years. SpaceX, the rocket company, has received billions of dollars in contracts from NASA. These are not historical examples. These are things happening right now. Government continues to play a crucial role in funding the technologies of tomorrow. The SBR program, which we discussed earlier, continues to operate. In recent years, it has distributed over $2 billion annually to small businesses working on everything from medical devices to cybersecurity to renewable energy. Many of these companies would not exist without SBIR funding. The program fills a gap in the innovation ecosystem. Venture capitalists generally do not invest in very early-stage companies that are still developing prototypes. Banks will not lend to companies without revenue. SBIR provides the initial capital that allows ideas to be tested. Some of those ideas fail, as expected, but some succeed and go on to attract private investment. This is a cost-effective way for government to support innovation. There are also newer programs worth noting. In 2011, the Obama administration launched the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership, aimed at revitalizing American manufacturing through investment in new technologies. In 2018, Congress passed the CHIPS and Science Act, which provided funding for semiconductor manufacturing and research. The goal was to reduce dependence on foreign chip suppliers and to ensure that America remained competitive in this critical technology. These are examples of government recognizing strategic vulnerabilities and taking action to address them. They are also examples of industrial policy, though they are usually not called that. Instead, they are framed in terms of national security or competitiveness. The rhetoric may be different, but the substance is the same. Government identifying important sectors and using public resources to support them. Now let us zoom out and consider the broader economic implications of the Silicon Valley story. One of the striking things about the last 70 years is how much wealth has been created by the tech industry. The market capitalization of the top tech companies is measured in trillions of dollars. The founders and early investors in these companies have become extraordinarily wealthy. There are dozens of tech billionaires and thousands of tech millionaires. This wealth is often celebrated as evidence of the power of innovation and entrepreneurship. But it also raises questions about distribution. If public investment played such a large role in creating the technologies that made these fortunes possible, is it fair that the gains are so concentrated? Mariana Mazzucato, whose work we mentioned earlier, has argued that the current system privatizes gains while socializing risks. When government-funded research leads to successful companies, the profits go to private investors and founders. But when government-funded research does not pan out, the losses are borne by taxpayers. This asymmetry seems unjust. Mazzucato proposes several mechanisms to address this. One is for government to take equity stakes in companies that emerge from publicly funded research. This would allow taxpayers to share in the upside when those companies succeed. Another is to create a fund, financed by taxes on successful tech companies, that would support further research and innovation. A third is to use patent licensing to ensure that publicly funded inventions generate revenue for the public. These are controversial ideas, and they face significant practical and political obstacles. But they point to a real issue. The current system does not adequately compensate the public for its contributions to innovation. There is also the question of inequality more broadly. The tech industry has created enormous wealth, but it has also contributed to growing inequality. Tech workers, especially engineers and executives, are very well paid. But the benefits do not extend evenly across society. Many regions of the country have not shared in the tech boom. Many workers in traditional industries have seen their jobs disappear due to automation and offshoring. The concentration of tech companies in a few geographic areas has driven up housing costs, making those places unaffordable for ordinary workers. These dynamics have created resentment and political backlash. Understanding the role of government in creating Silicon Valley might help us think about how to address these inequalities. If public investment helped create the tech industry, Perhaps public policy can help ensure that its benefits are more widely shared. One approach would be to invest more heavily in education and training, particularly in regions that have been left behind. The government could fund community colleges and vocational programs that teach skills relevant to the modern economy. It could support apprenticeships and on-the-job training. It could make higher education more affordable, reducing the debt burden on students. These investments would help more people participate in the tech economy. Another approach would be to invest in infrastructure that supports economic development in lagging regions. Broadband internet access is essential for participating in the digital economy, but many rural areas still lack reliable high-speed internet. The government could subsidize the deployment of broadband infrastructure, just as it once subsidized rural electrification. It could invest in transportation infrastructure that connects isolated communities to economic centers. It could support the creation of research parks and incubators outside of Silicon Valley, spreading the innovation ecosystem to more places. A third approach would be to strengthen social insurance programs that protect workers from economic disruption. As automation and artificial intelligence eliminate certain jobs, workers will need support to transition to new careers. Unemployment insurance could be made more generous and longer lasting. Health insurance could be decoupled from employment, reducing the risks of job loss. Universal basic income or other forms of direct cash support could provide a safety net for those who cannot find work. These are not new ideas, but they take on new urgency in the context of rapid technological change. The tech industry has disrupted many traditional industries, and more disruption is coming. Government has a role in ensuring that this disruption does not create social chaos. There is also the question of how to regulate the tech industry going forward. As we have seen, the light regulatory touch of the 1990s and 2000s allowed rapid innovation. But it also created problems. Tech platforms have accumulated enormous power over information flows, over commerce, over social interactions. This power can be abused. Companies can exploit user data. They can manipulate behavior. They can suppress competition. They can amplify harmful content. Regulation can address these problems, but it must be carefully designed. Overly prescriptive rules can stifle innovation. Rules that favor incumbents can prevent new competitors from emerging. Rules that fail to account for technological change can become obsolete quickly. The challenge is to create flexible, adaptive regulatory frameworks that protect the public interest without crushing innovation. Some advocate for breaking up the largest tech companies, arguing that they have become too powerful and that competition would better serve consumers. Others advocate for treating platforms like utilities, subjecting them to common carrier obligations. Still others advocate for stronger data protection laws, giving users more control over their personal information. Each approach has merits and drawbacks. Breaking up companies might increase competition, but it could also sacrifice economies of scale and scope that benefit users. Treating platforms as utilities might ensure fair access, but it could also burden them with regulations designed for a different era. Stronger data protection might enhance privacy, but it could also make it harder for new companies to enter the market, since they would lack access to the data that incumbents have already collected. There are no easy answers. What is clear is that the laissez-faire approach is no longer tenable. The tech industry is too important, and its impact too far-reaching, for government to remain passive. This brings us to a fundamental question about the relationship between government and innovation. For much of the 20th century, there was a rough consensus in the United States that government had an important role to play in funding research and building infrastructure. This consensus was forged during World War II and sustained during the Cold War. It led to the creation of agencies like DARPA and the NSA. It led to massive investments in universities and laboratories. It led to the internet, to GPS, to countless other technologies. But in recent decades, this consensus has frayed. There is more skepticism about government's ability to contribute to innovation, more faith in the magic of markets, more resistance to public investment. This shift is partly ideological. Conservatives have long been suspicious of government intervention in the economy, but it is also a result of the mythology around Silicon Valley. If people believe that innovation comes entirely from private entrepreneurs, then government investment seems wasteful. Reclaiming the true history of Silicon Valley is therefore not just an academic exercise. It has practical implications for policy. If we understand that government has always been central to American innovation, we might be more willing to support continued public investment. We might be more open to industrial policy. We might design tax systems that recognize the public contribution to private wealth. We might create institutions that ensure the benefits of innovation are more widely shared. The story we tell ourselves about Silicon Valley matters. It shapes what we think is possible. It influences what policies we support. And the story we have been telling, the story of the lone entrepreneur triumphing through sheer brilliance, is not just incomplete, it is misleading. It obscures the collective nature of innovation. It hides the role of institutions. It makes invisible the government investments that made everything possible. Let us now talk about what other countries have learned from Silicon Valley. For decades, governments around the world have tried to replicate Silicon Valley's success. They have created research parks and incubators. They have invested in universities. They have encouraged venture capital. Some of these efforts have succeeded to varying degrees. Israel has built a thriving tech sector, partly through government support for defense technology that has civilian applications. Taiwan has become a leader in semiconductor manufacturing, thanks in part to government-backed investments in TSMC. South Korea has developed world-class companies in electronics and telecommunications, supported by government industrial policy. But many other attempts have failed. Building an innovation ecosystem is hard. It requires not just money, but the right combination of institutions, culture, policies, and people. You cannot simply copy Silicon Valley and expect the same results. One lesson is that context matters. Silicon Valley emerged in a specific time and place, shaped by specific historical forces. The Cold War created demand for advanced technology. World War II had trained a generation of scientists and engineers. The westward expansion of the United States had created a culture of risk-taking and reinvention. Stanford University happened to have visionary leadership in Frederick Terman. The California climate was pleasant, attracting people who might have stayed elsewhere. The lack of enforceable non-compete agreements in California labor law created unusual labor mobility. All of these factors, and many others, came together in a way that is difficult to replicate. This does not mean that innovation ecosystems cannot be built elsewhere, but it does mean that there is no simple formula. Another lesson is that government investment is necessary but not sufficient. You cannot just throw money at universities and expect a Silicon Valley to emerge. You need the right kind of investment, sustained over long periods. You need institutions that can take risks and tolerate failure. You need cultural acceptance of entrepreneurship and of creative destruction. You need legal frameworks that protect property rights and enforce contracts. You need financial systems that can evaluate risky ventures. You need networks of people who know and trust each other. Building all of this takes time and requires coordination across many domains. Government can play a catalytic role, but it cannot do everything alone. A third lesson is that openness is important. Silicon Valley has always been open to immigrants, to new ideas, to unconventional approaches. This openness has been a source of strength. It has brought in talent from around the world. It has prevented the ecosystem from becoming stagnant. Countries that try to build innovation ecosystems while maintaining closed borders, rigid hierarchies, or state control over information are likely to struggle. Innovation thrives in environments where people are free to experiment, to fail, to challenge authority, to pursue unconventional ideas. This does not mean that anything goes. Rules and institutions matter, but there needs to be space for creativity and for dissent. China represents an interesting case. The Chinese government has invested heavily in technology over the past 2 decades. It has built world-class universities. It has supported companies in strategic sectors like renewable energy, electric vehicles, and artificial intelligence. It has encouraged entrepreneurship, and it has achieved remarkable results. Chinese companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and Huawei have become global leaders. China produces more STEM graduates than any other country. It publishes more scientific papers than the United States. In many ways, China has followed a playbook similar to the one that created Silicon Valley: heavy government investment, support for strategic industries, long-term thinking. But there are also important differences. The Chinese government exercises much more control over companies and over information. Dissent is suppressed. The internet is censored. Property rights are less secure. These factors may limit how far China's innovation ecosystem can develop, or they may not. It is too early to tell. The competition between the United States and China over technology leadership has become a defining feature of 21st century geopolitics. Both countries recognize that technological superiority is key to economic and military power. Both are investing heavily in emerging technologies. Both are trying to attract talent and to protect strategic industries. This competition has led to new forms of industrial policy in the United States: export controls on advanced semiconductors, investment restrictions on Chinese tech companies, incentives for domestic chip manufacturing. These are explicit acknowledgements that government has a role in shaping the tech sector. They mark a return to the kind of strategic thinking that characterized the Cold War era. Whether this is a good thing depends on how well these policies are designed and implemented, but it represents a significant shift from the hands-off approach of recent decades. Let us return to the United States and consider what the future might hold. Silicon Valley is no longer the only center of tech innovation in America. Other cities have developed thriving tech sectors: Seattle, home to Microsoft and Amazon; Austin, which has attracted many tech companies and workers; Boston, with its concentration of universities and biotech firms; New York, which has a growing tech scene. These cities demonstrate that innovation can happen in multiple places, but they also illustrate the challenge of scaling. None of these cities has replicated the full ecosystem of Silicon Valley. They have strong universities and talented people, but they lack some of the density and interconnection that makes the valley unique. Building these ecosystems takes time and requires sustained effort. There is also the question of what comes next technologically. Artificial intelligence is widely seen as the next major wave of innovation. Machine learning systems are already transforming industries from healthcare to finance to transportation. The companies that lead in AI will have enormous economic and strategic advantages. Both the United States and China are racing to develop AI capabilities. Both governments are investing heavily. Both are trying to attract top researchers. The outcome of this competition is uncertain, but history suggests that government will play a crucial role. Just as DARPA funded the research that led to the internet, just as NASA created demand for semiconductors, government investment and procurement will shape the development of AI. Other emerging technologies also have potential. Quantum computing could revolutionize cryptography and optimization. Synthetic biology could transform medicine and materials science. Fusion energy could provide clean, abundant power. Neurotechnology could enhance human cognition or treat brain disorders. Each of these fields is in its early stages. Each faces significant technical challenges, and each will require substantial investment to move from laboratory research to practical applications. Private companies will play a role, but government support will be essential, particularly in the early, risky stages. The question is whether the United States will make these investments and whether they will be made wisely. There are reasons for concern. Federal funding for research as a percentage of GDP has declined since the peak of the Apollo era. Universities face financial pressures that make it harder to conduct long-term basic research. Political polarization makes it difficult to pass legislation that would increase science funding. There is skepticism, particularly on the right, about the value of government investment. There is also complacency, a sense that America's technological leadership is secure and does not need active support. This complacency is dangerous. Other countries are investing aggressively. China, as mentioned, is pouring resources into strategic technologies. The European Union has launched major research initiatives. Smaller countries like Israel and Singapore are punching above their weight. If the United States does not maintain its commitment to public investment in research and infrastructure, its technological leadership could erode. But there are also reasons for optimism. There is growing recognition, even among business leaders, that government has a role to play. The CHIPS and Science Act, passed in 2022 with bipartisan support, demonstrated that Congress can still act on these issues. There is increased awareness of the risks of depending on foreign suppliers for critical technologies. There is renewed interest in industrial policy, reframed as economic security. If this momentum can be sustained, if institutions like DARPA and the NSF can be strengthened and replicated, if universities can be supported, if immigration policies can continue to attract global talent, then the United States can remain at the forefront of innovation. But it will require choices. It will require investment. It will require recognizing that government is not the enemy of innovation, but an essential partner. The story of Silicon Valley is ultimately a story about collective action, about how institutions, policies, and people working together can achieve things that individuals alone could not. It is a story about the power of long-term thinking, of strategic investment, of taking risks on uncertain outcomes. It is a story that challenges simple narratives about markets and government. Neither can succeed without the other. Markets are powerful mechanisms for allocating resources and driving efficiency, but they are not good at funding basic research, building infrastructure, or thinking beyond quarterly earnings. Government can do these things, and when it does them well, the results can be transformative. Imagine if the United States government after World War II had simply demobilized and returned to a minimal role in the economy. No DARPA, no ARPA, no massive defense contracts for electronics, no investments in universities and research labs, no Apollo program, no SBIC program to jumpstart venture capital. What would have happened? Perhaps innovation would have continued at a slower pace. Perhaps other countries would have taken the lead. Perhaps the technologies we take for granted today would have been delayed by decades. We can never know for certain. But the actual history is clear. Government played a central, indispensable role in creating Silicon Valley and the digital age. This does not diminish the achievements of the entrepreneurs and engineers who built the companies and products we use. Their brilliance and hard work were essential, but they stood on foundations built by collective investment, by taxpayers funding research they would never directly benefit from, by government agencies taking risks that no private company would take, by policymakers making choices that created space for innovation. Recognizing this history should change how we think about the future. It should make us more willing to invest in research and education, more willing to support infrastructure projects, more willing to take risks on emerging technologies, more willing to think long-term rather than focusing on immediate returns. It should also make us more thoughtful about how to distribute the gains from innovation. If the public contributes to creating transformative technologies, the public should share in the benefits. This does not necessarily mean government ownership or control, but it might mean more progressive taxation, stronger social insurance, greater investment in public goods. There are many ways to ensure that innovation benefits society broadly, not just a narrow elite. The key is to start from an accurate understanding of how innovation actually happens. The hidden economics of innovation are not really hidden. The information is available to anyone who looks. Historians and economists have documented the role of government in creating Silicon Valley. But this history has not penetrated popular consciousness. The mythology of the garage startup is too appealing. It fits too neatly with American ideals of individualism and self-reliance. It makes for better stories and better marketing, but it is time to tell a more complete story. A story that includes garages and geniuses, but also laboratories and libraries. A story that includes venture capitalists and entrepreneurs, but also program managers and procurement officers. A story that includes markets and competition, but also government investment and strategic planning. This fuller story is messier and more complicated, but it is true, and it is the story we need if we want to understand where innovation comes from and how to foster it in the future. As we approach the end of this long journey through the hidden history of Silicon Valley, let us reflect on what we've learned. We have seen how Frederick Terman transformed Stanford and created an ecosystem that linked universities, industry, and government. We have seen how defense contracts sustained young companies like Fairchild and allowed the semiconductor industry to develop. We have seen how DARPA funded the research that led to the internet and to countless other technologies. We have seen how the SBIC program helped create venture capital. We have seen how NASA's demand for integrated circuits drove down costs and accelerated progress. We have seen how immigration policy brought talent from around the world. We've seen how regulatory choices created space for experimentation. We have seen how all of these pieces fit together to create something remarkable. Silicon Valley was not inevitable. It was not the natural result of free markets working their magic. It was the result of deliberate choices and sustained effort over many decades. It required vision, patience, and a willingness to invest in the future. It required institutions that could take a long view and accept short-term failures in pursuit of long-term success. It required collaboration between sectors that are often seen as opposed: government and business, academia and industry, public interest and private profit. When these sectors work together effectively, when their strengths complement rather than undermine each other, extraordinary things become possible. The challenge now is to apply these lessons going forward. The world faces enormous problems that will require technological solutions. Climate change demands clean energy and sustainable practices. An aging population requires advances in healthcare and biotechnology. Resource scarcity requires more efficient use of materials and energy. Cybersecurity threats require new approaches to protecting digital infrastructure. None of these challenges will be solved by markets alone, and none will be solved by government alone. They will require the kind of public-private partnership that created Silicon Valley. Government funding, basic research, and setting ambitious goals. Private companies commercializing discoveries and competing to serve customers. Universities training the next generation and conducting cutting-edge research. All working together in an ecosystem that rewards risk-taking and learning from failure. There is no guarantee that the United States will rise to this challenge. The political will may not be there. The resources may not be allocated. Other countries may move faster. But the history of Silicon Valley shows what is possible when a nation commits to innovation, when it invests in its people and in long-term research, when it creates institutions that can think beyond the next election cycle or the next quarterly report, when it recognizes that government is not the problem but part of the solution. The digital age was built on a foundation of public investment. The question is whether we will lay the foundations for the next age, whatever that might be. Whether we will fund the research that pays off in 20 or 30 years. Whether we will build the infrastructure that the next generation will need. Whether we will make the choices that enable continued progress. If we do, we will look back on this era as a time when we understood the lessons of history and applied them wisely. When we recognized that innovation is not magic, but the result of sustained effort and strategic investment. When we rejected simplistic narratives in favor of complex truths. When we built on the legacy of those who came before us, just as they built on the legacies of their predecessors. And perhaps, decades from now, someone will look back on the innovations of the 21st century and tell a story. A story about how government dollars and private ingenuity came together to solve the great challenges of our time. How institutions and individuals collaborated to build technologies we cannot yet imagine. How a society made choices that created a better future. That future is not guaranteed. It will require work. It will require investment. It will require wisdom and courage. But it is possible. The history of Silicon Valley proves it. Government dollars did create Silicon Valley. Not alone, but as an essential partner in an ecosystem of innovation. Public investment laid the foundations. Private enterprise built upon them. Together they created something transformative. Something that changed how we live, how we work, how we connect with one another. Something that demonstrated what human ingenuity can achieve when given the right support and the right conditions. This is the hidden economics of innovation, not hidden deliberately, but hidden by the myths we tell ourselves, hidden by the stories that are simpler and more satisfying than the messy truth. But the truth is there for anyone willing to look. And understanding this truth is the first step toward building the innovations of tomorrow. So where does this leave us as we drift toward the conclusion of our journey? We've travelled 7 decades through the history of a place that has come to symbolize the future itself. We've seen how government and enterprise intertwined in ways that defy simple categorization. Neither purely public nor purely private, the Silicon Valley story is one of hybrid vigor, of complementary strengths combining to create something greater than either could achieve alone. The lesson is not that government should control innovation, nor that markets should be left entirely to their own devices. The lesson is that both have roles to play, and that the most dynamic economies are those that figure out how to make these roles complement rather than conflict with one another. Consider the current state of affairs. The tech industry is more powerful than ever, but it also faces more scrutiny. Concerns about privacy, monopoly power, misinformation, and the social impact of technology have led to calls for regulation. At the same time, the industry faces challenges that may require government support to overcome. The need to invest in next-generation semiconductor manufacturing, the need to develop quantum computing capabilities, the need to compete with China in artificial intelligence. These challenges are too large and too risky for private companies to address alone. They will require government involvement, just as previous challenges did. The question is whether we can have an honest conversation about what that involvement should look like. This conversation is difficult because it requires us to set aside ideological preconceptions. On the left, there is often hostility toward big business and skepticism about whether private companies can ever serve the public interest. On the right, there is often hostility toward government and skepticism about whether public institutions can ever be efficient or effective. But the history of Silicon Valley suggests that both of these positions are too simplistic. Private companies can create enormous value, but they build on public foundations. Government can be wasteful and bureaucratic, but it can also be visionary and effective, especially when freed from short-term political constraints. The key is to design institutions that harness the strengths of both sectors while minimizing their weaknesses. DARPA is a good model. It has a clear mission: to prevent technological surprises and to maintain American military superiority through advanced technology. It has significant resources and the freedom to use them as it sees fit within broad parameters. It takes risks on speculative projects, knowing that many will fail but that a few successes can be transformative. It draws on talent from universities, industry and government. It operates with relatively light bureaucracy. It does not try to commercialize technologies itself but makes them available for others to build upon. This model has worked extraordinarily well. DARPA-funded research has led to the Internet, GPS, stealth aircraft, and countless other innovations. The return on investment is almost impossible to calculate, but it is certainly enormous. Could this model be replicated in other domains? Could we create a DARPA for energy, focused on developing clean technologies and solving climate change? Could we create a DARPA for health, focused on curing diseases and extending healthy lifespans? Could we create a DARPA for education, focused on developing better ways of teaching and learning? In fact, some of these entities already exist in embryonic form. ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, was created in 2007. ARPA-H, focused on health, was established in 2022. These agencies are still small and relatively new, but they represent an attempt to apply the DARPA model to civilian challenges. If they are given adequate resources and allowed to operate with the same freedom that DARPA has enjoyed, they could be transformative. But institutional design is only part of the challenge. There is also the challenge of political will. Creating and sustaining institutions like DARPA requires sustained commitment over long periods. It requires patience, because the payoffs from basic research may not be apparent for decades. It requires tolerance for failure, because most speculative projects do not succeed. It requires insulation from short-term political pressures, because politicians often want to claim credit for immediate results, rather than investing in long-term possibilities. These requirements are not easy to meet in a democratic system where officials face regular elections and where public attention is easily distracted. Yet somehow, during the Cold War, the United States managed to sustain this kind of commitment. The question is whether we can do so again. Part of the answer may lie in how we frame the challenge. During the Cold War, investment in science and technology was justified in terms of national security. The Soviet threat made it imperative to maintain technological superiority. This framing allowed for sustained investment even when immediate results were not apparent. Today, we face different but equally serious threats. Climate change poses existential risks. Competition with China has economic and strategic dimensions. Pandemics can disrupt societies and economies. Cybersecurity threats can undermine critical infrastructure. Each of these challenges could potentially justify the kind of sustained public investment that characterized the Cold War era. The question is whether political leaders can articulate this case effectively, and whether the public can be convinced to support it. There is also the question of how to ensure that the benefits of government-supported innovation are widely shared. As we have discussed, the current system tends to concentrate gains in the hands of a relatively small number of investors and entrepreneurs, while the costs and risks are borne by taxpayers. This creates inequality and undermines political support for public investment. If taxpayers feel that they are funding research that primarily benefits the wealthy, they will be less willing to support such research. There are several possible approaches to this problem. One is to have government take equity stakes in companies that emerge from publicly funded research, as Mariana Mazzucato has proposed. Another is to use tax policy to recapture some of the gains from innovation, perhaps through higher capital gains taxes or wealth taxes on the ultra-rich. A third is to invest more heavily in public goods like education and healthcare, ensuring that everyone has access to the tools they need to thrive in a technology-driven economy. Each of these approaches has pros and cons, and each faces political obstacles. But the underlying principle is clear. If innovation is a collective endeavor, if it depends on public as well as private investment, then the reward should be collective as well. This does not mean perfect equality. Some inequality is inevitable, and perhaps even desirable, as it provides incentives for risk-taking and hard work. But the current level of inequality, where a handful of individuals accumulate fortunes in the tens or hundreds of billions, while many ordinary workers struggle to make ends meet, is neither necessary nor sustainable. It undermines social cohesion and democratic legitimacy, and it is based on a false premise that these fortunes are entirely the result of individual effort, rather than being built on foundations of public investment. Let us consider one more dimension of this story: the environmental and social costs of technological progress. Silicon Valley has created enormous wealth and transformed how we live, but it has also contributed to problems. The production of electronic devices requires rare earth minerals that are often mined under exploitative conditions. The energy consumption of data centers contributes to climate change. The algorithms that power social media platforms can amplify division and undermine democratic discourse. The displacement of workers by automation creates economic insecurity. These are not arguments against technology. Technology has brought immense benefits, from medical advances that save lives to communication tools that connect people across the globe. But they are arguments for thoughtful governance of technology, for ensuring that innovation serves broad social goals rather than narrow private interests. Government can play a role here as well. It can set standards for environmental sustainability, ensuring that the production and use of technology does not irreparably harm the planet. It can regulate how data is collected and used, protecting privacy and preventing abuse. It can support workers who are displaced by technological change, providing retraining and social insurance. It can invest in research on technologies that address social needs rather than just those that promise private profit. Clean energy, affordable housing, accessible healthcare, better education. These are all areas where technology could make a difference, but where private incentives alone may not drive sufficient innovation. Government can fill this gap by funding research and creating markets for socially beneficial technologies. This is not about stifling innovation or picking winners and losers in some heavy-handed way. It is about recognizing that the direction of technological change is not predetermined. It is shaped by choices, by what gets funded and what does not, by what regulations are imposed and what freedoms are protected, by what values are prioritized. These choices can be left entirely to markets, in which case technology will develop in directions that maximize private profit. Or they can be influenced by democratic processes, in which case technology can be steered toward broader social goals. The history of Silicon Valley shows that government has always influenced these choices, whether explicitly or implicitly. The question is whether we can be more intentional about it going forward. As we near the end of our exploration, it is worth reflecting on the power of narratives. The story we tell about Silicon Valley shapes how we think about innovation, about government, about capitalism itself. The dominant narrative, as we've discussed, is one of entrepreneurial genius and free market dynamism. This narrative is appealing because it celebrates individual achievement and aligns with deeply held American values, but it is incomplete and in some ways misleading. By leaving out the role of government, it creates a distorted picture of how innovation actually happens. It makes it seem as though success is purely a matter of individual brilliance and hard work, ignoring the institutional support and public investment that makes such success possible. This distorted narrative has real consequences. It influences policy debates, often in ways that undermine future innovation. If people believe that government is irrelevant or even harmful to innovation, they will oppose public investment in research and infrastructure. They will support tax cuts that starve government of resources. They will resist regulation even when it's necessary to address market failures. The result is a weakening of the very institutions and policies that made Silicon Valley possible in the first place. This is a form of collective forgetting, where we lose sight of the foundations upon which current prosperity rests. Reclaiming the full story is therefore not just about historical accuracy. It is about creating a basis for sound policy going forward. If we understand that innovation is a collective endeavor, requiring both public and private contributions, we will make different choices. We will be more willing to invest in basic research, even when the payoff is uncertain and far in the future. We will be more willing to support universities and scientific institutions. We will be more willing to fund infrastructure that benefits everyone. We will be more thoughtful about how to distribute the gains from innovation, ensuring that they are shared broadly rather than concentrated narrowly. And we'll be more intentional about steering technology towards socially beneficial ends. So what have we learned on this long, slow journey through the hidden economics of innovation? We have learned that Silicon Valley was not born from a vacuum. It was built on decades of government investment in research, education, and infrastructure. We have learned that every major technology underlying the digital age, from semiconductors to the internet to smartphones, has roots in publicly funded research. We have learned that institutions like DARPA and the NSF played crucial roles in funding risky long-term research that private companies would not undertake. We have learned that government procurement created markets for new technologies, allowing them to scale and become economically viable. We have learned that policy choices around regulation, immigration, intellectual property and education shaped the environment in which innovation occurred. We have also learned that this history has been largely hidden from public view, obscured by a mythology that celebrates individual entrepreneurs while ignoring institutional support. We have learned that this mythology has consequences, making it harder to sustain the kind of public investment that fostered Silicon Valley in the first place. And we have learned that other countries are trying to learn from Silicon Valley's example, with mixed results, because context and institutions matter as much as money. Most importantly, we have learned that the mythology surrounding Silicon Valley, while appealing, obscures these realities and makes it harder to sustain the policies that foster innovation. The future is uncertain. We face challenges that will require new technologies and new approaches. Climate change, aging populations, resource scarcity, geopolitical competition, pandemics, cybersecurity threats. These challenges are different from those of the Cold War era, but they are no less urgent, and they will require the same kind of long-term thinking, strategic investment, and public-private collaboration that created Silicon Valley. The question is whether we have the wisdom and the will to apply these lessons, whether we can move beyond simplistic narratives about markets and government, whether we can design institutions that harness the strengths of both sectors, whether we can ensure that the benefits of innovation are broadly shared rather than narrowly concentrated. The story of Silicon Valley is ultimately hopeful. It shows that humans can solve extraordinarily difficult problems when we work together, when we pool resources, when we think long-term, when we're willing to take risks and learn from failures, when we create institutions that support rather than stifle creativity. This is not a story about perfection. Government made mistakes. Companies failed. Resources were wasted. But on balance, the system worked. It produced technologies that have transformed the world. It created prosperity. It demonstrated what is possible when we combine public purpose with private ingenuity. And if we can remember this history, if we can tell the full story rather than the simplified myth, then perhaps we can create the innovations of tomorrow with the same boldness and vision that created the innovations of yesterday. As you lie there, wherever you are, perhaps you feel differently now about the device in your hand or the technology around you. Perhaps you see it not just as a product of individual genius, but as the culmination of decades of collective effort. Thousands of scientists conducting experiments, hundreds of program managers evaluating proposals, dozens of policymakers making crucial decisions, millions of taxpayers funding research they would never directly see. All of these people, most of them anonymous, contributed to the world you inhabit. They are the hidden architects of the digital age, and their work continues. In laboratories across the country, researchers are exploring quantum computing, synthetic biology, fusion energy, artificial intelligence. Much of this work is funded by government grants. Some of it will fail, but some of it will succeed. And decades from now, people will use technologies that do not yet exist, built on foundations being laid today. This is the cycle of innovation. Research funded today pays off tomorrow. Infrastructure built now enables breakthroughs later. Students trained in this generation become the innovators of the next. It is a long game, requiring patience and faith. Faith that investing in knowledge is worthwhile even when the applications are not immediately clear. Faith that supporting people and institutions will yield results eventually. Faith that the future can be better than the present if we work toward it. This faith has been justified by history. The Internet started as a speculative research project and became the foundation of the modern economy. GPS began as a military navigation system and became essential infrastructure for countless civilian applications. The microchip was developed for missiles and spacecraft, and ended up in everything from phones to refrigerators. What technologies currently in development will have similar trajectories? What research being conducted in obscure laboratories will transform daily life 30 years from now? We cannot know for certain, but we can create the conditions that make such transformations possible. We can fund basic research. We can support universities. We can create agencies like DARPA that take risks on ambitious projects. We can think strategically about which technologies matter for our future. We can design policies that encourage innovation while ensuring its benefits are widely shared. We can tell honest stories about how innovation happens, acknowledging the collective nature of the endeavour rather than perpetuating myths of isolated genius. These are choices within our power, and the choices we make will shape not just the next generation of technology, but the kind of society we become. Silicon Valley today stands at a crossroads. It has achieved extraordinary success, but that success has created new challenges. The companies that emerge from the ecosystem now wield enormous power over information, commerce, and social interaction. They shape what people see, what they buy, what they believe. This power raises questions about accountability and governance. How much control should these companies have? How should they be regulated? What responsibilities do they bear to society? These are not easy questions, and there are legitimate disagreements about the answers, but addressing them will require the same kind of public-private collaboration that created Silicon Valley in the first place. Government cannot simply impose solutions from above without understanding the technologies involved. Companies cannot simply resist all oversight in the name of innovation. There needs to be dialogue, negotiation, a recognition that both sectors have legitimate interests and important roles to play. The pandemic of 2020 provided a glimpse of what such collaboration can achieve. Governments funded vaccine research through programs like Operation Warp Speed. Pharmaceutical companies used that funding to develop vaccines in record time. Regulatory agencies expedited approval processes while maintaining safety standards. The result was vaccines that saved millions of lives, developed faster than anyone thought possible. This was not pure market capitalism. It was not pure government control. It was partnership, public money de-risking private research, public institutions providing coordination and oversight, private companies bringing expertise and execution capability. When the stakes were high enough, when the need was urgent enough, the system came together and delivered. The question is whether we can sustain this kind of collaboration for other challenges that are equally important but less immediately visible. Climate change is one such challenge. The technologies needed to address it, from advanced batteries to carbon capture to sustainable fuels, will require enormous investment and long-time horizons. Private companies will play a crucial role in commercializing and scaling these technologies. But government will need to fund the basic research, create the initial markets through procurement and regulation, and provide the long-term policy certainty that enables massive capital investments. This is already happening to some extent. The Department of Energy funds clean energy research. State and federal governments provide tax credits for renewable energy. Other countries, particularly China, are investing heavily in green technologies, but the scale of investment needed is far greater than what is currently happening. Meeting the challenge of climate change will require a level of government involvement comparable to what occurred during the Cold War. It will require treating climate as the existential threat that it is and mobilizing resources accordingly. Artificial intelligence presents both opportunities and challenges. AI systems have the potential to accelerate scientific discovery, improve healthcare, enhance education, and solve problems that are currently intractable. But they also raise concerns about privacy, bias, job displacement, and even existential risk if advanced AI systems are not properly controlled. Government has a role in both enabling AI development and ensuring it proceeds safely, funding research into AI safety and ethics, creating regulatory frameworks that protect against misuse while not stifling beneficial applications, supporting workers who may be displaced by automation, ensuring that AI development serves broad social interests rather than narrow commercial goals. The United States is in competition with China for AI leadership, which adds strategic urgency to these questions. But the competition should not lead to a race to the bottom, where safety and ethics are sacrificed for speed. Biotechnology is another frontier where government and private sector will need to work together. The ability to read and write DNA, to engineer organisms, to create new medicines and materials offers tremendous potential. Diseases could be cured, lifespans extended, food production revolutionized. But there are also risks. Engineered pathogens could be weaponized. Genetic modifications could have unintended consequences. Inequitable access to biotech could exacerbate inequality. Here too, government has essential roles, funding basic research in genomics and molecular biology, regulating safety and ethics of genetic engineering, ensuring broad access to breakthrough therapies, thinking through the implications of technologies that could fundamentally alter human biology. These are not questions that can be left to markets alone. The pattern should be clear by now. For every emerging technology, there are roles that only government can play. Funding basic research that is too risky or too long-term for private investment. Building infrastructure that benefits everyone. Setting standards and regulations that protect safety and ethics. Creating markets through procurement. Thinking strategically about national interests. Ensuring equitable access to benefits. These roles are as important now as they were when Silicon Valley was being built. Perhaps more important, given the power and reach of modern technologies. The question is whether our political system can rise to the challenge, whether we can sustain long-term commitments in an era of short attention spans and partisan polarization, whether we can make smart investments rather than politically convenient ones, whether we can learn from history rather than repeating old mistakes. There are reasons for concern. Political polarization makes it difficult to reach consensus on major investments. Short election cycles incentivize politicians to focus on immediate results rather than long-term gains. Special interests can capture regulatory processes. Bureaucratic sclerosis can slow decision-making. These are real problems, and they can undermine effective governance. But they are not insurmountable. Institutions like DARPA have shown that government can be nimble and effective when properly designed. The success of Operation Warp Speed showed that bureaucratic barriers can be overcome when there is political will. The history of Silicon Valley shows that sustained investment over decades can yield extraordinary returns. The capacity for effective government action exists. The question is whether we will use it. Part of the answer lies in how we educate the public about these issues. If people understand that innovation is a collective endeavor, that government has always played a crucial role, that public investment generates enormous returns, then they will be more likely to support such investment. But if they believe the mythology, if they think that innovation is purely a private sector affair, then they will resist government involvement. Education matters. Honest storytelling matters. Helping people understand the real history of how technologies are created matters. This is not about propaganda. It is about accuracy, about giving people the information they need to make informed decisions about policy. It is also about gratitude, the technologies we enjoy, the prosperity we experience, the conveniences we take for granted. All of these rest on foundations built by previous generations. Scientists who conducted experiments that seemed arcane at the time. Policymakers who made investments whose payoffs would not be seen for decades. Taxpayers who funded research they would never personally benefit from. These people, collectively, gave us the world we inhabit, and we have an obligation to do the same for future generations, to make the investments that will pay off long after we're gone, to fund the research whose applications we cannot foresee, to build the institutions and infrastructure that others will use. This is the bargain between generations, and it is a bargain that has worked throughout history. As we come to the close of this long exploration, as the night deepens and your eyes perhaps grow heavy, let me leave you with a final thought. The question is not whether government should be involved in innovation. History answers that question definitively. Government has always been involved, and its involvement has been essential. The question is how it should be involved. What institution should it create? What investments should it make? How can it maximize benefits while minimizing costs? How can it ensure that innovation serves the public interest? These are questions without simple answers. They require wisdom, judgment, careful thought. But they are the right questions to ask, and asking them honestly, without ideological blinders, is the first step toward answering them well. Silicon Valley was not an accident. It was not the inevitable result of free markets. It was built, deliberately, over decades, through strategic choices and sustained investments, through collaboration between sectors that are often seen as opposed, through a willingness to take risks and to think long-term, through institutions that combined public purpose with operational flexibility. And the story of how it was built, the hidden economics of innovation, is a story we need to remember. Not to glorify government, not to diminish the achievements of entrepreneurs, but to understand accurately how progress happens, so that we can make wise choices about the future, so that we can build the next generation of transformative technologies, so that we can ensure that the benefits of innovation are widely shared and that the costs are not unfairly distributed. This is the story I've tried to tell you tonight. A story about government dollars and Silicon Valley, about DARPA and Stanford, about semiconductors and the internet, about risk capital and research grants, about the hidden foundations of the digital age. I hope it has given you a different perspective. I hope it has complicated your understanding in productive ways. I hope it has helped you see that innovation is neither purely public nor purely private, but collaborative. That success requires both individual brilliance and institutional support. That the future is not predetermined but shaped by choices we make collectively. And I hope that as you drift off to sleep, or as you go about your day, you will carry this understanding with you, that you will see the technologies around you differently, that you will think about policy differently, that you will ask better questions about how we foster innovation and for whose benefit, because these questions matter, and the answers we give to them will shape not just the economy, but the kind of society we become. Thank you for taking this journey with me, for your patience with the complexity, for your willingness to question comfortable myths, for your openness to a fuller, richer understanding of how innovation happens. The story of Silicon Valley is ultimately a hopeful one. It shows that we can solve hard problems, that we can create transformative technologies, that we can build a better future, but only if we understand honestly how it is done, only if we recognize the roles that different actors play, only if we are willing to make the investments and build the institutions that success requires. The choice is ours, the future is unwritten, and the next chapter of the innovation story is waiting to be created by all of us. Together, good night.